You have invited me, and I'll tell you why this is very important. I am an alumni of the University of Dar es Salaam, or the Faculty of Law of the University of Dar es Salaam. But I can assure you, I cannot be invited to the University of Dar es Salaam, to the School of Law nowadays, to speak on anything. So I don't take this invitation for granted at all, because freedoms, intellectual freedoms and basic freedoms generally, are a very scarce commodity in our countries nowadays. So thank you again for inviting me. I first came to Uganda and to this great university and to the then Faculty of Law, Makerere University, in early December of 1992. It was my very first trip out of Tanzania. I was a second-year law student from the Faculty of Law of the University of Dar es Salaam. That was more than 32 years ago. The occasion then was the East African Law Students Conference, organized and hosted by the Makerere University Law Society. And so, Madam President, Madam Chairperson, after a 32 years hiatus, I'm very happy to reconnect with the Faculty of Law, Makerere University again. Today, I return here 32 years later as the recently elected chairman of the largest opposition party in Tanzania and a political figure of some notoriety, if not in East Africa, certainly in Tanzania. Anna has told you of my trials and tribulations. It has been a very long and a very interesting 32 years, if you ask me. Please allow me to speak a little about this university. And I do this not because you don't know what this university is all about, but because we always need to remind ourselves of the traditions, of the great traditions that our universities represent for our countries and our societies. Makerere holds a very special distinction in the history of East African countries and societies that perhaps no other institution of higher learning in the region does. Growing up as I did in rural central Tanzania, where I was born and raised, the elders spoke of Makerere in hushed tones. When they said, "Huyu ametoka Makerere," this one comes from Makerere, it was a statement that needed no elaboration, and it demanded instant respect. To be associated with Makerere, set you apart from the crowd. The reason cannot be far-fetched. Makerere was the academic epicenter of the region. Coming here was the pinnacle of academic achievement, a testament to intellectual excellence. Makerere, this place, produced Uganda's first prime minister, as you may know, Ben Kiwanuka. It produced Uganda's first, third, and fourth presidents in the persons of Apollo Milton Obote, Professor Yusuf Chironde Lule, and Godfrey Binaisa. Makerere also produced Kenya's third president in the name of Emilio Mwai Kibaki. This institution also produced 2 of Tanzania's 6 presidents, including, more importantly, the subject of today's public lecture, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. At the risk of offending the nationalist sensibility of my justifiably proud hosts, please allow me to venture to say that Mwalimu, as Nyerere is fondly called in Tanzania, Mwalimu is by far the most illustrious Makerere alumni of them all. But I should not get ahead of my story, because I need to speak about, to justify the subject of my lecture today. What is it about Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere and Uganda? Speaking of Mwalimu in terms less than reverential and adulatory in Uganda carries considerable risks. It is especially so when the speaker is a prominent and controversial opposition politician known for his outspoken, no-holds-barred style. Ugandan Catholics, led by the First Family, have led a regional, perhaps continental effort to have Mwalimu canonized as a Roman Catholic saint. Yet, here I am to talk about Mwalimu, the great secular political leader and politician whose actual record as such leader and politician is perhaps points in the opposite direction to the Catholics' effort to make him a saint. You Ugandans may overwhelmingly view him as the Mkombozi who rid you of the hated Idi Amin Dada and his bloodthirsty regime, which had terrorized the nation for 8 long years. Yet, I'm here not only to celebrate that incredible feat of selflessness, but also to interrogate his other less savory legacies, which continue to torment not only us in Tanzania, but I suspect Ugandans as well. Whatever one thinks of him, Mwalimu towered over the politics of Tanzania and Uganda like the colossus he was. His influence in Kenya was no less significant, even if it is less celebrated. His long shadow continues to hover over our collective heads 4 decades after he left his presidential office and nearly a quarter century after his passing. So what is it that makes him this great figure, this figure that Catholics want to make a saint out of him? Allow me to start by talking about Mwalimu's Pan-Africanist legacies. because Mwalimu is perhaps more known for his work as a liberation leader for much of Southern Africa. He is more well known for his Pan-Africanist legacies than perhaps any other. Mwalimu's Pan-Africanist credentials have long been celebrated at home and abroad. He not only founded TANU, Tanganyika's independence movement, and led it to Tanganyika's independence in December of 1961. He inspired a host of other African nationalists to follow the same path. By the way, talking about inspiration to others, has any one of you here ever wondered why Kenya's leading nationalist movement, which was founded in May 1960, was named KANU? Tanganyika's was TANU, founded in July of '54. Kenya's nationalist movement, KANU, was founded in May of 1960. Why this similarity in names? Have you ever wondered why Zimbabwe's ZANU, founded in August of 1963, is named ZANU? Or Mozambique's MANU, Mozambique African National Union, founded in Mombasa in February of 1961. Have you thought of asking why Namibia's first independence movement was called SWANU, founded in September of 1959? All these nationalist movements were inspired by Mwalimu and his TANU. And many of these nationalist movements called Dar es Salaam their home in their early years. Dar es Salaam of the 60s and the 70s was the base for many of these parties. This is because when the Organization for Africa Unity, OAU, the forerunner to today's Africa Union, was founded in Addis Ababa in May of 1963, it chose Dar es Salaam and Tanzania as the headquarters of the OAU African Liberation Committee to coordinate the liberation struggles which were beginning to take off in much of Southern Africa. The first of Africa's political refugees to settle in Tanzania were therefore not Obote and fellow Ugandans who were kicked out by Idi Amin in 1971, but the Southern African exiles of the early 60s, such as ZANU's first president, Herbert Chitepo, who also happened to be Tanganyika's first African Director of Public Prosecutions. Mozambican exiles, such as Frelimo's first president, Eduardo Mondlane, and the second president, Samora Machel, also had their homes and bases in Dar es Salaam and in Tanzania, as was the case with leaders of SWANU and later SWAPO. When the frontline states were established following the collapse of Portuguese colonial rule in 1975, Mwalimu became the chairman of the frontline states, the position he held until he relinquished his political powers in 1985. So Mwalimu's Pan-Africanist credentials are very well established. What about his constitutional legacies, the subject of today's talk? While his Pan-Africanist legacies are well known and have been widely acknowledged, his contributions in Africa's constitutional development is less so, but it was no less significant. Mwalimu may rightly be described as one of the founding fathers, not only of the modern African nationhood, but also one of the progenitors of Africa's constitutional authoritarianism, which has blighted the African political and constitutional landscape for decades. The authoritarian state that is personified by what Professor Okoth Ogendo, Kenya's leading constitutional scholar, called the imperial presidency, was largely created in East Africa by Mwalimu Nyerere. So while we know much about his Pan-Africanism, his contribution in the development of authoritarianism founded on the constitution of the state is well less known, but it is absolutely significant. Mwalimu took his cue from Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, his Pan-Africanist rival on the continent. He took his cue in the constitutional development of the continent from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And he developed the authoritarian constitutional order first in Tanzania and later exported it to the neighborhood, Uganda, and to some extent, Kenya. Starting with the Republican Constitution of Tanganyika of 1962, Mwalimu created the imperial presidency, which, as I've said, was very well described by Professor Hastings Okoth Ogendo in a 1993 paper. Mwalimu's republicanism led to the abolition of chiefdoms in Tanganyika, and I know, speaking in Uganda, how the issue of Uganda's kingdoms has been touchy all these years. He did not only destroy chiefdoms. Mwalimu's republicanism also subjugated parliament, creating what has been described as largely a rubber stamp, turning an institution which had been the most powerful institution of state at independence into an extension of his ruling party. Mwalimu's appetite for totalitarian control led to the disbanding of independent trade unionism in 1964, the dissolution of peasant cooperatives in 1966, to the suppression of multi-party democracy in 1965, and the state control of the economy after the Azimio La Arusha 1967, the suppression of independent press in 1969-70, and the dissolution of elected local government system in what was essentially an Orwellian decentralization policy in 1972. And soon after the dissolution of local government, Mwalimu and his TANU embarked on what James Scott, a scholar of peasant societies, has described as, quote unquote, the largest forced resettlement scheme undertaken in independent Africa up to that time. By the time that resettlement scheme ended in 1977, over 9 million rural Tanzanians had been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and relocated in Ujamaa villages, which were run by government-appointed managers. By this time, too, independent student unions in the country's sole university had also been suppressed, and their place was taken by the state-controlled student organization, which was run under the auspices of the sole ruling party then, TANU, and later CCM. And therefore, when we speak of Mwalimu and his constitutional legacy, first and foremost is the creation of this authoritarian Leviathan, the state which hovered over the life of the nation like no other. The state that had total control of the lives and livelihoods of the people of Tanzania. Now, at the top of that constitutional Leviathan was Mwalimu, the president. Under the constitution he created, Mwalimu literally became above the law, and he was accountable only to his God. He was not only the head of state, he was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, he was the head of government, he was the appointing authority of all judges, of all members of various constitutional and statutory commissions. He appointed all heads of civil service departments, of government-owned state corporations, of institutions like the central bank and public universities. Until he left, Mwalimu was the chancellor of the University of Dar es Salaam. And the constitution declared that all state employees who were not directly appointed by the president were deemed to have been appointed by him and certainly worked on his behalf, worked in his name, and he was the disciplinary authority of last resort. Over and above that, the president appointed all judges and justices of the country's Court of Appeal. He appointed them at his total discretion. He appointed at his discretion all members of the country's electoral commission. He appointed the clerk of the National Assembly, the chief executive officer of the National Assembly. He appointed a certain number of members of parliament. He appointed the central bank governor, and the list goes on and on. And therefore, when we speak of an imperial presidency created by Mwalimu, the president became what Professor Issa Shivji has described as the giver and taker of life, liberty, and livelihoods. He could decide who would live or die. He could pardon criminals. He could declare war. He owned the land. He owned the minerals. All the natural resources of the country. They were all placed in the hands of this constitutional Leviathan, and a Republican president, not an 18th century European absolute monarch. So that is the most important contribution of Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere in the constitutional development of Tanganyika. All African countries which were formerly under British colonial rule, literally all of them, emerged from colonialism with constitutions which had a Bill of Rights. Not so Tanganyika. Mwalimu refused British attempts to introduce a Bill of Rights in Tanganyika's independence constitution. And he continued to resist the introduction of the Bill of Rights until 1984, a year before he stepped down as president. He always argued that we do not need a law that prescribes limits on the government. We should not create constitutional straitjackets. We should not introduce constitutional limits to the power of the government and the power of the president, because the state, in Mwalimu's view, was this benevolent institution whose mission was to bring development to the people. And therefore, he argued it should not be encumbered by a Bill of Rights. The courts should not be given the power to curtail the government's mission of bringing development to the country and the people. So by 1985, when he left office, the people of Tanzania were under the total control of the government, which prescribed every inch of their day-to-day lives. Growing up as a child, you only went to government school, a government primary school. You only went to a government hospital. You only went to a government secondary school. You shopped in a government-owned shop or an Ujamaa village shop. You wore whatever shirt or shoes you got them from a government-controlled outlet. You only listened to Radio Tanzania Dar es Salaam. If you happen to be in towns such as Dar es Salaam, you only read government-owned Daily News or CCM-owned Uhuru newspapers. There was, beyond those two newspapers, there was nothing. There was no television, nothing. If you were employed either directly by the government or by a government-owned state corporation or by some other government-owned institution. And you did not negotiate your salary, it was prescribed for you by the government. Those were years when we were totally dependent. We became totally dependent on Mwalimu's state. You could not complain anywhere. There were no rights. There were no independent trade unions. There was no way of organizing independent of the government-prescribed organizations. There were years of permanent shortages of everything from sugar and soap and everything that you take for granted when you go down to Wandegeya to shop. Right? And it all came down from this monolithic state that Mwalimu created. Talking of our politics, of Mwalimu's politics, one of the most characteristic features of our politics under Mwalimu was something that you should know very well, being Ugandans: the militarization of politics and the politicization of the armed forces. I've been reading these past 2 days, I've been reading somewhere of a Ugandan professor, perhaps from this university, complaining that UPDF, Uganda People's Defense Forces, have someone called the political commissar. And that professor, the learned professor, alleges that there are only 2 countries in the world which have political commissars in their armed forces: Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China. Well, with all due respect, the professor didn't have to travel to Russia or China to know about political commissars. From 1964, when the Tanzania People's Defense Force, TPDF, yours is called? UPDF, right? Where did you get UPDF from? From 1964, when Tanzania People's Defense Forces were established following the army mutiny of January 64, the Tanzanian armed forces have always been heavily politicized. Tanzania's armed forces have always been politicized. Tanzanian politics have always been militarized. It cannot come as a small wonder then that of Tanzania's 6 presidents, one, Jakaya Kikwete, was a very senior army officer. Of Tanzania's 6 or 7 prime ministers, 2 of them were very senior military officers. They include one chief justice who was a major general in TPDF. And that is to say nothing. That is to say nothing of possibly hundreds of senior army officers who have served in various capacities in politics and in civil administration as ministers, as regional commissioners, as district commissioners, as heads of government parastatals, and so on and so forth. So the phenomenon of militarization of Ugandan politics and the politicization of your UPDF, I dare say, have nothing to do with Putin or Xi Jinping. They have everything to do with Julius Kambarage Nyerere and Tanzania. Where did Yoweri Museveni grow up? All of you know that he went to Dar es Salaam, to the University of Dar es Salaam. Very few of you know that he literally lived in Mwalimu's State House. What happens when Mama Maria Nyerere comes to town here? Mzee and his entire family come. He doesn't wear that big hat of his in Mama Maria's presence. He literally grew up under Mwalimu's wings. And all this revolutionary adventurism of his started in Tanzania. And therefore, you should not be surprised that your armed forces are Uganda People's Defense Force, like his beloved Tanzania People's Defense Forces. Now that is a direct we okay? The oversized role that your armed forces play in today's politics in Uganda were almost wholly borrowed from Tanzania. And I suspect many of the generals here trained in Monduli outside Arusha. That is Mwalimu's legacy, his constitutional legacy for you. But it is not just that. Let's go back to the early 60s. When Uganda gets independence in 1962, in October of 1962, Tanganyika is only 2 months from becoming a republic. Mwalimu is in the process of carrying out a constitutional coup, changing the country's entire constitutional order from a parliamentary democracy he had inherited in 1961 at independence to a republican form of government with an executive president at its head. So Uganda gets independence when Tanganyika is becoming a republic with an imperial president. When Uganda gets independence, there is already in East Africa, there is already in Tanganyika, a ready model of governance which gives whoever is in power, whoever is in control of the instruments of state, real powers. Now you know, because you're here, you know that the constitutional settlement that was negotiated at Lancaster House made Uganda a federal state with kingdoms, with districts, and the territory of Mbale, right? Uganda's federalism was very well established in the constitution and entrenched. You could not change the federal character of the Ugandan state except with very high majorities. It made for a very complicated system of government. It made for political leaders who were severely constrained in their ability to deploy power. And because of Uganda's ethnic demographics and that complicated constitutional settlement, it was very difficult to change that system into a republican form of government with a kind of ease that had characterized the transformation of Tanganyika into a republic in 1962. So to transform Uganda into a republic with an executive president required a military coup by Milton Obote in 1966, in February of 1966. You should know this history, I hope. What is the constitutional order that Obote imposed? The so-called Pigeonhole Constitution of April 1966. If you look at the Pigeonhole Constitution and the Constitution of 1967, which was adopted a year later, one thing stands out: the imperial presidency. The imperial presidency that Mwalimu Nyerere had created for Tanganyika with the Republican Constitution in 1962. Milton Obote required the assistance of Uganda Army led by a colonel, later Brigadier Idi Amin, to create that Republican constitutional order with an executive president. The order that emerged out of that coup and the two constitutions was in all fundamental respects a reflection of the constitutional order that had ensued in Tanganyika after the Republican Constitution was adopted in 1962. Imperial president, a president who could appoint literally anybody of any consequence in Tanzania, in the country, in Uganda. And the same model was adopted when Idi Amin threw out Milton Obote in 1971. It was carried over into Yusuf Lule's government after Amin was kicked out with the Musaada wa Wakombozi from Mwalimu 1979. It was institutionalized again in Obote II. And who can say today, with Yoweri Museveni and your constitution of 1995, who can say that Uganda does not have an imperial president under the current constitution? All that, my argument is, all that was inspired by Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And you know, he did not only inspire constitutional development in that direction, he also interfered massively in Uganda's internal political processes. Anyone doesn't know this? He did not only overthrow Idi Amin, he installed Professor Lule, and when Lule started acting too independently, he had him removed, all right, in Mwanza. You should read Professor George Kanyehamba's book on the constitutional development of Uganda. He tells the story of how Lule was removed. They were all summoned in Mwanza, and the deal was done. Interfered heavily in Uganda's internal politics. He paved the way for the return of Milton Obote II through the halfway house called Paulo Muwanga and his defense minister, one Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. So whatever you think of Milton Obote, whatever you think of what happened during those 5 painful years, from 1980 to 1985, to July 85, when Obote was once again thrown out by the army, you should never forget that Obote's return for the second time was engineered by Mwalimu Nyerere. And therefore, he bears a not small contribution in the torment that Uganda went through during those years. And he was also, as I said, the political father figure of your current president. The one thing that we should not blame Mwalimu for, I think, as I said, he was a great man. One of the things that testified to his greatness was his decision in 1985 to relinquish power voluntarily. Tanzania became the first country in Africa to successfully institute presidential term limits, the first on the continent, and it is thanks to him too. That it has not held in Uganda, it was tried, right? It was tried thanks to his inspiration. It was presidential term limits were instituted here, I argue, thanks to Mwalimu, to his inspiration, to his example. That they have not held. He should not be blamed for the fact that presidential term limits have not survived here. Maybe if we say that he contributed in a way because of the imperial presidency that he inspired here and elsewhere. But his introduction of presidential term limits has held in Tanzania and has been adopted in almost every other constitution you can think of in modern Africa. Even if in few countries there has been a backsliding. So we can thank Mwalimu for presidential term limits, the constitutional legacy of Mwalimu. What else? What else? Mwalimu loved university. He loved intellectual debates at university. During his long tenure in office, Mwalimu encouraged academic freedoms at the country's sole university. He loved going to the university to battle it out with students and faculty. He allowed freedom nowhere else. You had no right to speak anywhere else but the university. If you go today to the University of Dar es Salaam today and to our universities beyond Dar es Salaam, that great tradition of academic freedom has been lost. Today, our universities have become jailhouses where academic freedom is imprisoned. Mwalimu let it flourish. And standing here today at Makerere, his alma mater, I urge you all to protect that one distinguishing factor that characterized Mwalimu and his university: intellectual and academic freedom. Fight to protect your right to speak, right to protect your academic freedoms here in this great university. So let me finish. Let me finish so that we may ask questions. What do we make then of Mwalimu? What do we make then of this great man? One, he was a man of his times. The period of the 1960s was a period of what scholars have described as dirigisme. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. It was a period of state control of the commanding heights of the economy. It was a period of the state as a provider of social services, not just in Africa, but it started in Western Europe, and that is why Mwalimu counted as his close friends all Western social democrats, from Willy Brandt in Germany to Sweden's Olof Palme, and the British labor leaders of the period. So he was a man of his period, a man of his times. Number two, he could have made different choices. It was not a given that we should have taken the direction that Mwalimu took. Saaseret Sechama of Botswana, who led his country to independence in 1965, did not take that road. And today, people sing praises of Botswana as one of the few success stories, it is partly because Sir Seretse Khama, the first president, did not choose the path that Mwalimu chose. He had choices, and he should be judged for choices that he made. Number three, he was a human being. He was fallible. There have been a huge investment in politics as well as in the church to canonize him, to make him either a political saint. If you are in Tanzania, Mwalimu is untouchable, or a religious saint, as in Saint Julius. There has been a massive investment to make Mwalimu a saint, whether a secular political saint, or a religious saint, as in those efforts which started here with Ugandan Catholics. But Mwalimu, I believe, they are doing this because Mwalimu is no longer with us. Mwalimu would have been the first to admit that he was first and foremost a political leader. He was a devout Catholic, yes, but he never was a religious leader of any not. He was a political leader, and as such political leader, he could sign death sentences, and he did sign several death sentences. He put people into detention without trial. He conducted war. We always talk of the Uganda War of 1979. Read Museveni's planting the mustard seed, and you will know that there were all kinds of troubles emanating from Mwalimu's Tanzania into Amin's Uganda. In fact, one of our regional police chiefs was killed inside Uganda, and he was not returned to Tanzania until after 1979. What business was the regional police commander doing deep inside Uganda in 1972? Mwalimu had a very activist foreign policy. He sent Tanzania's armed forces to overthrow governments in Seychelles, in Comoro. He had Tanzanian soldiers fighting in liberation wars in Mozambique and elsewhere. He was a very activist. He had a very activist foreign policy, like someone you know very well. Now that's another legacy of him. He was first and foremost a political leader. He did not allow rights. He was not accountable to anyone. He was one of the most honest people you can imagine. He died a poor man. In fact, he died without a pension. Mwalimu got his pension statutorily provided in April of 1986, almost a year after he had relinquished presidential office. So he left office without a pension. He didn't steal. His family are paupers by Tanzania's recent standards. He's a very honest man. And there is a great value to be attached to that. But he created the constitutional and institutional incentives for the massive corruption that the country suffers from today. He created a system of government which was completely unaccountable to anyone. So that is Julius Kambarage Nyerere and his legacies for you. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you.
Mimi naitwa Juma, mmiliki wa magari ya usafirishaji wa mizigo na abiria. Natumia bima papo kwa sababu inaruhusu kuweka TIN namba yangu wakati wa kununua bima. Inafanya iwe rahisi kudai vati kutoka TRA kwa kutumia hati hiyo hiyo ya bima. Uwezo wa kupata mkopo bwana. Hii inasaidia sana kugharimia mambo mengine ya uendeshaji hata kama bajeti inabana.
Tumia bima papo kwa kupiga *150*51 alama ya reli au kwa WhatsApp tuma neno bima papo kwenda namba 0764166066 ujipatie bima.
Bima papo. Urahisi wa maisha.